Hello and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Dragon's Library. So I just wanted to, because I don't want to spend too much. I wanted to start this early so that I could maybe end it a little early and get to dinner because I'm hungry. But also, we don't have a lot of pages left. I want to say we've got 40 pages left, a little shy of 40 pages. So we should be able to wrap this up. I'm hoping this afternoon. If you haven't been, for some reason, Mixer doesn't want to pick this stream up again today. So what I want to double check is my sound because I don't have my headset on normally for this show. So give me one moment. For some reason, there we go. All right, so I just wanted to double check the sound, which we're all good there. And Mixer's not picking it up. So we're all on YouTube today. So anyway, this is my novel, which I have been sort of doing this audiobook podcast while I edit, sort of a live edit, live reading of my book. Thought it would be interesting. It was an idea I got from another author when I was doing a symposium at Gen Con. He had done this and got a lot of good response, a lot of good feedback, and I thought it might be fun to do. And because I'm facing the reality that I may have to self-publish this book, it is really challenging to get published. It's challenging to find an agent, to find a publisher that'll take a chance on a new author. It's just not that easy. It's not as easy as people think it may be. I believe Orson Scott Card compared it to being eaten by a shark and struck by lightning at the same time. The odds are slim. So, and I'm impatient facing that reality. I'm impatient. I don't want to wait forever to get this book published. I've got other books I want to write and get out to you, and I just don't want to wait around. So this book, we're near the end. If you haven't been following along, the previous episodes of this show are on the Frags and Beer Network on YouTube. You can find them and listen to all of them. I also, every time I do this, I share the link to the online copy of this book, so to speak, which is no longer entirely the same. We've made edits as we went, and you guys have been voting on a poll. And so if you didn't catch it, check my Twitter feed over the last couple days. There is a poll there because I got to change the title. I currently call it The Last Exodus, which is taken by about 2 or 3 other books and stories. So I don't want to use that. And right now I believe Embers of Liberty is in the lead by a pretty vast margin for the title of this book. I had an idea of what I wanted to call the book, but I couldn't settle on the wording. So I put it out to you guys and said, let me know what you think. And you guys are letting me know. So I really appreciate it because that is, it's very helpful. This process is not easy and it's a little stressful. It's a little intimidating. So any little help you guys are giving me is amazing. So I appreciate it. Wouldn't be Frags and Beer Network without a little beer. But no frags today. The show today is all about this book. So we're going to get started. It is a political book. If you have not read this or listened to the show, it is a dystopian political sort of thriller set in the not too distant future. So bear that in mind. I'm not going to candy coat it. This is a book about political issues and social issues, so it is a political book. It's not like I'm trying to shoehorn it into anything else. That is what this book's about. My next book, not so much, so you can hopefully enjoy if you're not into the politics. Hopefully the next book will be more enjoyable, but if you do like politics or thrillers or dystopian stuff, this might be it. So we're on chapter 41. We just left, let me see here. Yep, so they've recaptured Casey, who was the federal agent in charge of capturing the people who have left Stewart, Illinois. I'm not going to recap too much. People are moving from Illinois to the Republic of Texas because most of America has gone super extreme as far as its policies. People are assigned jobs, people are assigned housing. They don't have a whole lot of freedom. They basically are told what to do for the collective good. And a group of people from Stewart, Illinois are not having it, and they decide to move. We are getting close to the end of their journey. There was a federal agent tasked with capturing them. That's Lieutenant Casey. He has failed, and he's been captured by the group instead. They are continuing their trek west to actually Oklahoma, which is part of the new Republic of Texas. And that's where we are. They just got through a sort of encounter in the woods of Missouri with a militant group, militant rebels, and they got away, and that's where we're at. So chapter 41. Again, each chapter opens with an excerpt from John Everman's journal. John is our protagonist, if you will. So every chapter I try to give some insight into, it's twofold. There's insight into John's personality and his beliefs, and there's a little bit of history of this world that I've created so that you know how things got the way they are. So chapter 41. The road that got us here was paved with good intentions, as the saying goes. Every plan, law, or initiative started out as a way to help people, protect people, or increase opportunity. Somewhere along the way, those good intentions were taken advantage of by the corrupt opportunists that found ways to game the system for their own political gain. The corruption changed our mindset. A system designed to help those who could not help themselves became a system that helped those who would not. One of the clearest symptoms of the fall was the rise in unemployment due to a failing economy. Some people found it was more profitable to not work, and as unemployment continued to rise, government felt compelled to continue helping with more benefits. It became a vicious cycle that, for many, justified the sweeping changes to come. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. Like I've said when I started this and a few times through this series, I built a lot of this world based on real world examples of what people believe and what people proposals. I took the most extreme proposals that people would make about how to make the world better, and thought what would happen if these really bizarre ideas or these crazy ideas became reality. And some of this stuff is based on what really happens. I mean, and I would have to find it, but there's a report out there that says that for every generation of people that are on government assistance, it becomes harder and harder for them to get off of it. It's a combination of things that cause that, but as we're going into fourth and fifth generations of people on government assistance, it's harder and harder for those people to find ways to get off of it, to find better opportunities, to find jobs, education, things like that. It becomes more difficult. And that's sort of where this comes from, this idea that the more people on unemployment, the more people getting benefits from the government, the more people, and you always have people that game the system regardless of where you are. There's always going to be that, and that causes sort of a snowball effect, and that's what created a lot of the problems in John's world. We can't take him with us after what he did. Amanda's voice was quiet, but the strength of it was as potent as a shout. Amanda's John's wife. The group leaders were gathered on the overgrown fairway of the dark golf course. So they just made their way through a town in the middle of the night, and they were all to meet on this golf course. And as I wrote this story, I actually did use Google Maps to plan their route from central Illinois to Oklahoma, and I found a lot of landmarks and towns and real places and rivers and lakes and roads in this golf course. It really does exist south of the town that they just passed through. And so that's where they're at. The refugees had made it there safely, and three people with the captured rifles watched the east to make sure they weren't followed. Todd was watching Casey, who had his hands tied behind his back and was being kept apart from everyone else. I don't think I need a comma there because Todd's not being, yeah. We can't leave him here either. The militia are sure to come looking, John said. Is that so bad, John? Kyle asked. He and his husband were the last to join John's group before they left Stewart, and he tended to be a bit more cold when it came to dealing with people outside the group. No, I'm fine with the way that's a Microsoft Word doesn't like the way that word combination goes, but I've got no problem with it. John's group when they left Stewart, and he tended to be a bit more cold. hearted, maybe? Maybe it just doesn't like when it came to dealing with people outside the group. That'll work. He did try to hurt us, and his people did kill Steve, Kyle finished. John didn't need a reminder of how the federal officers had hurt them. Leaving a man to die is no better than killing him yourself, John said with finality. Then we should let him go and take our chances, Amanda said. She was still furious about finding a gun pointed at John's face only hours after her friends had sacrificed some of their rations to feed the officer. We can't take the chance he'll be able to get help at the border, John explained. It had been a long night, and John didn't foresee any sleep in his immediate future. He was exhausted and worried about being followed, but he knew he couldn't push the group any further without rest. He was growing frustrated with the situation, but took a deep breath and reminded himself of a saying his grandfather was fond of. God never gives you more than he knows you can handle. He took a deep breath to clear his head and calm down. He's going with us at least until I've been trying to fix this too. I used to write very formally. I never used contractions and things like that, and now it sounds weird, but yeah, I'm trying to write the characters more human rather than robotic. He's going with us at least until we're too close to the border for him to warn anyone, John said with finality. John already said things with finality. He could see the decision wasn't popular, but everyone accepted it. The rest moved off to join their... You know what? I like that there, actually, because he ends the debate with that one. We want to change the one up here. Yeah. He could see the decision wasn't popular, but everyone accepted it. The rest moved off to join their groups and get what little rest they would have time for. A little rest they could. Amanda stayed behind while John watched them leave. She still looked angry, but he could tell it wasn't directed at him. I still think it's too dangerous to keep him around, Amanda said. John nodded, staring off after the others. I won't leave him to die or take the risk of letting him go yet. Take the risk of letting him go yet, John said. We don't know the militia will kill him, Amanda said, but her voice betrayed her own uncertainty on that. I'm not willing to bet his life on it. Yeah, we need to change that. That sounds more natural. I'm not willing to bet his life on it. You're too decent for your own good sometimes, John. She gave him a hug and kissed him before returning to their camp to sleep. Despite the danger and her previous anger, let's change that. I don't like that. She was proud of him. She rolled up in her sleeping bag. Knowing John had more to do and wasn't likely to get any sleep himself, she didn't wait for him to follow. John found Casey sitting against a tree in the dark. His hands were tied behind his back, and Todd was standing nearby holding a pistol. Todd's eyes were flinty, and they never left the federal officer. Casey watched John approach, his face betraying no emotion. Make sure it was Todd that was watching him. For some reason, I feel like it was a different person. Todd was watching it. Okay, yeah. Alright. So what's the verdict, John? Casey asked when John was close enough that he didn't have to shout. You leaving me here for the militia to finish me off yourself? You leaving me here for the militia or finishing me off yourself? It bothered John that Casey thought those were the only two options open to him. Neither, John said. I can't let you go either. You're coming with us. Both Casey and Todd were shocked, speechless by that statement. Todd looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the words. And seeing the look on his friend's face, he decided that was probably best. John was in no mood to argue about it any further. You know what I need to look up, though? I always forget, and this is important. Farther. Because one of these cases I've used further in the wrong way. Farther for physical distance, further for metaphorical. So I think... I think I misused it up here. I think I misused it. Where is it? Farther. Here's where I used it. Farther. Farther's for distance. All right. Both Casey and Todd were shocked, speechless at that. John was in no mood to argue about it any further. Casey had fully expected to die soon, either at the hands of the fugitives or the militia. He knew that would be the risk. He knew that would be the risk when he pulled the rifle on John in the woods. He hadn't even expected to make it out of that situation alive the moment he heard we don't need had there. The moment he heard Amanda's voice in the darkness behind him. Being kept with the group wasn't even a consideration while he waited to hear his fate. I can't imagine that was a popular decision, Casey said. He had seen Todd's reaction and knew the others had to feel the same. What had that decision cost John, Casey wondered. The right choice isn't always the easy one, John said. John sat down across from Casey with his back against a tree, leaning his head against the hard trunk and holding his pistol firmly in his hand. Get some sleep, both of you. Early start in the morning, John said without looking up. The conversation was over, and neither Todd nor Casey minded. It had been a long night for everyone. Todd returned to his sleeping bag that was laid out near Jennifer's, and Casey rested back against his own tree. They were both asleep in moments, and John was left alone in the dark, with nothing but the wind and night sounds to drown out his worry. We don't need a comma there, I don't think. Yeah, I wish Mixer was better at this. Seems to not like my streams that don't have any video. Or Restream is just pooping itself. That's probably what's going on. All right, we're just going to shut that off because it's not working. All right, so the next 4 days were relatively uneventful for the refugees and went a long way to raising their spirits. I think what I need here actually is a scene break. I don't use these terribly often, but I need to put that in. All right. The next 4 days were relatively uneventful for the refugees and went a long way to raising their spirits. They weren't being chased by federal agents. The towns they did pass were mostly empty, and morale rose as the once harrowing flight from Illinois turned into a peaceful excursion in the country. I think we need to break that sentence up. It's too long. They weren't being chased by federal agents. The towns they did pass were mostly empty, and morale rose as the once harrowing flight from Illinois turned into a peaceful excursion in the country. John was the only one that wasn't able to relax. He was worried the change wasn't so much a respite from the storm as the calm before the worst of it. John used the time to plan, moving along their line of travel from group to group. He reminded each group leader about the rest of the route, going over the map that he carried and making sure each knew the destination in Oklahoma. If anyone was separated from the group, John wanted to be sure they knew where to go and how to find everyone else. He also prepared everyone for the last obstacle between them and the border, Fort Joplin. Everyone in America knew about Fort Joplin and the role it played in the Civil War. Its location near the border, large airport, and connection to several major highways made it the perfect spot for the American War Command. Fort was a loose word, as the city was not surrounded by a wall or even a fence, except around the airport and important military buildings on the north side of town. But so many troops, tanks, helicopters, and other assets were located there. We need to fix this. This is way too long there. So many troops, tanks, helicopters, and other assets were located there that Joplin and the surrounding towns became the largest military I do not like that sentence at all. So many troops, tanks, helicopters, and other assets were located there. They had become... So many troops, tanks, helicopters, and other assets were located at Joplin and the surrounding towns. They had become the largest military installation in America. John knew they had no choice but to go around, but how far around was the question. He would need to be close enough to see it, to know how far away they needed to be to avoid patrols, searchlights, and flyovers. Near the end of the fourth day after escaping the Ozarks area, the group was camped on the north side of a small rise about a mile away from Fort Joplin. They were surrounded by trees with a canopy thick enough to shield them from the air, but just in case, no fires were lit, and everyone... We're going to make that 2 sentences. Just in case no fires were lit, and everyone was instructed to move around as little as possible. The refugees all sat in small groups, eating and talking quietly, but mostly watching in nervous apprehension for what lay ahead. John, Todd, and Amanda were crouched low on the rise overlooking Joplin. Even with the war at a virtual stalemate, Joplin was an active installation. Military vehicles moved in every direction on unknown errands. Important buildings, or what John guessed were important, were lit up with massive banks of lights. Formations of soldiers could be seen moving in different areas, and the airport was lit up and busy with activity. There was one dark spot in the landscape between the two towns that made up the fort, but other than that, there were lights everywhere, as if the place never slept. We're going to do that. Why did we come this way again? Todd asked the rhetorical question everyone was thinking. Too far out of our way to go around on a different highway, and everyone is already exhausted, John answered anyway. They had considered the possibility shortly after leaving the Ozark area, but they decided it was too much of a risk to hope one of the smaller farm roads was still there. The closer they got to the border, the more the military had altered the landscape from what the map showed. The refugees, being unfamiliar with the area and having limited cross-country navigation skills between them, the odds of getting lost were too high. "There's our shot," John said, pointing to the band of darkness between the towns. Fort Joplin was made up of the city of Joplin to the west and Carthage on the east. They were separated by about 5 miles of old housing divisions, grassland, and trees. The two towns were connected by a major highway that had regular traffic even at night, which meant military traffic, since curfew kept civilians inside at that time. We don't need to specify at night. As far as John could tell, the old homes were unoccupied, since no lights had been visible in the windows, even close to sundown when they settled down to watch. "There's a lot of traffic on that highway," Amanda said, watching the crawling twin lights in the distance. "There," Todd said, pointing. "That looks like an overpass. We might be able to slip through there in groups without being seen." We might be able to slip through in small groups without being seen. Todd was indicating a spot in the highway that was well lit and seemed to rise up over the flat land. From that distance, it was hard to tell, but it did look like the highway spanned a depression of some sort. "We'll have to get closer to know for sure, but it's worth the risk. I don't want to be caught anywhere near here when the sun comes up," John said. "We'll need to move quickly." Amanda... say this as John explained. Once again, she was glad they had sent the children ahead in the van, despite the pain of being separated from them. Do you suppose it's always this active? Todd asked. I don't know, but let's pray if something is going on. It has nothing to do with us, John said. Replied. John's leg was better, though he still had a bit of a limp when they jogged back to the waiting refugees. John explained the plan to the nervous people back at the camp. The idea of crossing such a wide-open terrain close to the two towns didn't help their anxiety, but everyone was definitely glad to be on the move. With fear fueling them, the refugees moved as fast as the darkness would allow. Everyone sensed the danger even before they reached the same overlook where the others had scouted the area. There was a tension in the air everyone could feel, like right before a storm. When the first of the group did reach the overlook, the sight below stopped them in their tracks. The fort below was even more active than when John left it. When the lead group stopped, he and Todd moved up to see what was wrong, and the change worried him. Before, Fort Joplin just seemed to be busy, but upon their return the entire place was on full alert. Searchlights were scanning the sky and ground around the city. More vehicles were moving on the roads, and the whole installation was lit bright as day. You don't think they knew we were coming, do you? Todd asked, unable to take his eyes off the spectacle below. Can't imagine how, John said. His voice didn't sound too sure. The highway seems busier, Todd said apprehensively. It did appear that more vehicles were moving. Hold on. It did appear that more vehicles were moving away from the city. Right. We need to move now. We have a long way to go, and I don't like the looks of all of this, John said. Todd nodded and started ushering the first of the refugees down the hill. The light from the moon in the fort cast a dim glow across the landscape that made travel safer. So everyone moved a little faster when they started down toward the highway. After the last person was over the top of the rise, Amanda stopped and tilted her head to the side. What's that? She asked. What? John stopped and looked at her curiously. I don't know. It's like a sound I can't quite hear, but I can feel it. She put a hand to her chest. Here. John listened for a moment, then he heard and felt it too. The realization of what was coming hit them both at the same time, but it was John that vocalized it. Helicopters. The urgency in that one word was enough to start them down the hill at a run. John didn't know the purpose of the helicopters, but from the sound there were a lot of them. He feared that this was the end of the line for him and the others. He could see the others running ahead, Todd with Casey, friends and neighbors and people he had met on the journey. He had led them all to this place, this time, and all the forces against them were converging. All they could do was run for their lives, but he feared it wouldn't be enough. A flash of light banished the night from the direction of the airport. Seconds after the flash, the sound and shockwave hit the refugees, knocking many to the ground or to their knees. Some screamed and all turned their eyes to the columns of flame birthing from the airfield. What is happening? Amanda shouted over the roar of the explosions. I don't know, just run, John shouted. He was staring in horror at the scene opening up over the fort. The helicopters they had heard were coming in from the west, over Fort Joplin, and the streaks of tracer fire highlighted each of the aircraft as they rained hell on the ground beneath. John snapped out of it with the realization that the helicopters were not there for him and his people. Just run, he shouted again. All right, so things got a little crazy. Welcome to the show, whoever just joined over on YouTube. So we're doing a live reading / edit of my novel. Sort of a interactive audiobook. So by all means, thanks for showing up and listen. And if you do have any thoughts or ideas or questions, let me know. We're getting close to the end. Chapter 42. An old adage that we lost sight of was, if you let the government give you rights, you're also subject to having the government take them away. We forgot that government is meant to protect those rights we, by nature's law, already have. When Washington offered to give us things we should have been earning ourselves, all under the guise of more rights, we accepted with closed eyes and opened arms. Then those rights became too expensive, we started to lose them again. So many were surprised. Our basic rights are considered inalienable because no one can give them to us, and while a person or government may try to take them away, they are ours to protect. These basic rights need no other person to supply them. No one must become a slave to us to maintain them, nor do we need to be slaves to another. We carry them with us everywhere, and they are free, but may cost everything. We forgot that for a time, but I promise to remember it forever. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. Yeah, I put that in there sort of as an important point in not only John's beliefs, but in the beliefs of a lot of people that I think would be like John, in that there's a reason that our true rights, that our real rights are pretty limited and pretty broad. They're not real specific. And they aren't given to us by anybody. They're ours just for being people, for being human beings. And when you start having an entity, a government or an organization or whatever, give you rights, you have to realize that because they're giving them to you, they can take those away. Just if the scratch of a pen gives you the right to something, the scratch of a pen can take that away. And that's sort of what John's world has turned into. It turned into a world of where a fickle government just did whatever it wanted, and it really screwed up the lives of these people, is why they left. So it's an important insight into John's belief and why he has done what he's done, why they picked up and left, and all of this. So years later, John would have trouble recalling the events of the Battle of Joplin. The events all we're going to say years later, John would have trouble recalling the Battle of Joplin. The events all blended together into a frightful flight under flashes of light and rumbles of explosions. When time dulled the memories, he would be reminded of that night in every thunderstorm or loud noise and flash of light. He would always remember the fear and anxiety, the doubt about whether he had done right, and the insecurity about whether they would survive his decisions. His only consolation that night was that his children and the children of his friends were safe and would grow up in a better place. So I got a lot of commas in there, and I want to see if I can clean this up. This is a bad habit of mine that I've been trying to break on my new writing, but it's still in there in my old stuff. When time dulled the memories, he would be reminded of that night in every thunderstorm or loud noise and flash of light. He would always remember the fear and anxiety. The fear, let's say the fear and doubt about whether he had done right. Whoops. He would remember the insecurity about whether they would survive his decisions. Anxiety. His only consolation that night was that his children and the children of his friends were safe and would grow up in a better place. The refugees raced across the field toward the highway. Distant sounds of gunfire and explosions caused people to flinch away and cry out, even though the battle was taking place more than a mile away. John shouted for everyone to keep running and helped along those who helped those. That's a bad way to phrase that. John shouted for everyone to keep running and helped those who stumbled or fell behind. At some point, Casey's bindings were removed, probably so he could maintain his balance, but John didn't care anymore. He'd rather the officer escape than hurt himself. "What's happening, John?" Amanda shouted. "I don't know, but this distraction is a miracle," he said, as he helped someone who stumbled over a tree limb. He didn't let on that he was afraid the miracle was actually a disaster. The others needed hope against their fear. He couldn't afford to show his own. Their flight to the highway overpass seemed to take forever, but it was faster than it would have been without the danger of the nearby battle. All the while, the fighting was confined to the larger city of Joplin, close enough to hear They were close enough to hear and feel the explosions and see the flashes of lights, but too far away to make out details. The highway traffic seemed to swell as civilian vehicles fled the city and military trucks headed in. When refugees reached the overpass, they heard a loud rumbling from the east in the direction of the smaller town. The rumble had a metallic clanking accompaniment that set John's teeth on edge. John had wondered what new horror was descending upon them. People were waiting near the overpass when John made it to the shadow of the concrete bridge. They weren't sure what to do after the plan changed. John could hear the whooping sound of helicopters coming close. Move, just move. The plan's shot. We need to get out of here. All their planning up in smoke in the chaos. All their planning had gone up in smoke in the chaos of the battle. John could only pray now. He prayed everyone would get to the other side alive and whole. People rushed en masse under the concrete roadway, moving around the supports to get clear of the overpass. Trucks roared on the pavement overhead, and the rumbling, clanking sound in the east grew louder. When John stepped out from under the bridge himself, he thought he could hear the helicopters getting closer as well, and then he was sure of it when he saw the lights. The aircraft were scanning the ground as they approached the highway. The sense that something awful was about to happen crashed over John like a tidal wave. His fear and anxiety peaked. Oops. Todd, we need to get everyone as far from here as possible, John shouted to his friend. Move now. Let's get across this field, he said to those closer to him. People ran for the trees that bordered the old field about 100 yards to the south of the highway. The ground was uneven and dangerous, but when someone fell, their neighbor helped them up, and they kept running. John was last, making sure no one fell behind. As they neared the trees, the sounds of approaching helicopters became louder. The aircraft roared overhead and flew toward the road. The trees nearly bent double at the downdraft, and many of the refugees were forced to their knees or knocked off their feet. The vehicles were so low it was like standing in a hurricane. The refugees watched in horror as the night was lit up by a sudden burst of light and streaks of tracers when the tanks on the highway opened fire on the helicopters. Did they notice that they were tanks? Well, I started describing the sound. I'm not sure if I ever clarified that they were tanks until this point. He looked up the sound. He'd been unable to identify. Saw bulk of tanks. There we go. So John was last, making sure no one fell behind. He looked up at the sound he'd been unable to identify and saw the metal bulk of tanks rolling across the overpass overhead. All right, so the refugees watched in horror as the night was lit up by sudden bursts of light and streaks of tracers when the tanks on the highway opened fire on the helicopters. The pilots above returned fire with rockets launched from pods on their sides and a large gun extended from the nose of the vehicles. John didn't. I think we need to clarify. We don't. Pilots above returned fire with rockets launched from pods. Mounted on the sides. And large guns extending from the nose of the aircraft. John didn't know much about weapons and nothing about helicopters, but the display was impressive and horrifying. Burning streaks of light and streamers of smoke lit the night all around the terrified civilians. The resulting explosion sent the refugees running into the trees to get away from the scene. John stayed long enough to see a rocket fired from somewhere along the line of tanks, hit one of the aircraft and sent it spinning to the ground. The metal monster hit the dirt, its blades churning earth like a terrible plowing machine as the vehicle tore itself apart in the crash. He didn't wait to see any more. Acrid smoke joined the sounds of battle as the refugees pushed through the trees and ran across the next field. John rushed ahead and started directing people to head south and west so they could make their way around the fort about a mile to the south of it. About a mile beyond. Who's attacking Joplin? John asked when John got close. Todd asked when John got close. I don't know, maybe rebels, John said. It's forces out of Texas, Casey said nearby, breathing heavily from the run and bleeding from a cut on his forehead. John had forgotten in all the confusion that the officer was with them. He didn't forget. John was surprised that the officer was still with them. There we go, that'll work. How can you be sure? John asked. There hasn't been fighting for years. The flags, Casey said, working to catch his breath as they ran. Texas flags on the choppers. John nodded. He'd missed seeing any emblems on the aircraft. I also heard a report, Casey began again. A report at the border post that there was a build-up. Why now? Todd asked, dodging a tree limb that was in his path. Can only guess, but a hit this big is probably a message, Casey said, now holding a hand to his side. We've been probing the border near Colorado. This is meant to make us stop. Their running conversation was interrupted by a group of old Humvees driving through the field across the refugees' path. The vehicles were speeding from the east, bouncing and careening across the uneven terrain toward Fort Joplin. John guessed they were reinforcements from Carthage. I wonder if we're spelling that right, because Word doesn't like it, but that doesn't always mean anything. Yeah, we're spelling it right. We're going to stick with that. Alright, one of the gunners riding with his head and arms outside the top of a Humvee must have noticed the large group of people in the field and mistaken them for invaders. He tugged back on a lever on the weapon in front of him and swiveled the gun toward the civilians. Toward John's group. The flash and thump of the machine gun made John jump and the refugees scattered. Todd pulled Jennifer out of the way as the weapon raised tiny geysers of dirt while the soldier brought the weapon to bear. Tracers raced through the group like rocket-propelled fireflies. Miraculously, no one was hit. While John watched the raw violence of the scene, the murderous fireflies started arcing up into the sky and were joined by others. The convoy had stopped, and the gunners were firing at something above the refugees. It was then that John realized he was hearing and feeling the helicopters again. The aircraft were coming back for the Humvees, and John's people were caught in the middle. Everyone down now, John shouted and waved his arms. People who saw or heard him pulled those who didn't to the ground. I don't like the phrase. People dropped to the ground. And pulled their neighbors down with them. The helicopter screamed overhead and people screamed below, covering their heads as if fleshy shields would protect them from anything the two armies rained down on them. Rained down, we don't need on them. John pulled Amanda down and covered her with his own body, but couldn't help watching the battle unfold around him. Machine gun fire from the convoy lit up the sky, burning arcs of light toward the helicopters. The aircraft received the hits, and some even seemed to be damaged by the curtain of devastation they were flying into. All of them fired their main guns at the ground vehicles, apparently out of rockets after their battle with the tanks earlier. The entire battle was The fight was over in moments, and John's eyes saw nothing but spots and flashes after. The helicopters flew away, leaving behind a line of burning wrecks and stunned civilians in the churned and scarred field. John saw one of the pilots look down at the huddled civilians when the helicopters passed close to the ground. He wasn't sure if it was a good or a bad thing. With the destruction of the convoy and the disappearance of the helicopters, everyone started to get to their feet and run for the trees again. They skirted the burning hulks of the Humvees and avoided looking at the bodies of the former occupants. When someone did look, they shuddered at the sight of bodies burned and decimated by fire and bullets. The sounds of the battle were again a distant thunder for the refugees. They ran, stumbled, and fell their way through open fields and clusters of trees for more than a mile, always moving steadily south and west. John, Todd, Amanda, and the other leaders just kept everyone moving despite pain, exhaustion, and fear. It seemed that everyone was hurt in some way. Cuts from flying bits of metal, scraped knees from falls, and twisted ankles from the rough terrain were all too common. John saw them all and thanked God everyone made it in one piece and was able to keep moving. When the battle seemed like ancient memory behind them, the group started to slow and collect themselves. People sat down right where they stopped or bent near double, coughing and trying to catch their breath. Most of the refugees had lost their bags, but they still had all of the firearms they had picked up along the way. Casey was still with them when John was with them. Casey was still with them. John was... Yeah, I didn't write that. John was relieved to see Casey was still with them. Is everyone mobile still? John asked Todd. Is everyone's... That's stupid. Nobody talks like that. Is everyone still mobile? John asked Todd. John and Amanda were sitting on the ground back to back, supporting each other while they caught their breath. I think so. Just tired, Todd nodded. We need to keep moving, but I think we can take it slower, John said. Just a few minutes longer, Amanda gasped between deep breaths. Shh. Todd held up a hand and the two fell silent, but didn't hear what had caught his attention. I heard something, Todd whispered to their questioning looks. Others were starting to notice and all fell silent. After a moment, John heard it too. There was a rustling sound in the trees south of them as if someone were trying to walk quietly through dry leaves. John waved everyone to stay quiet and dropped down. Everyone did, lying as flat in the grass as they could. While they watched, a large group of armed soldiers walked out of the trees, scanned the clearing ahead, and scanned the trees and scanned the clearing ahead of them. They were all armed with military rifles and wore heavy body armor over camouflaged uniforms. They weren't a group of backwoods militia, but professional soldiers. For a brief moment, John's instinct was to defend himself and the others, but he quickly stifled that thought. They stood no chance if it came to a fight. Don't shoot, we're just civilians, John said loudly before the soldiers could stumble upon them. He slowly rose to his knees and raised his arms so they could see his hands. The reaction of the soldiers was instantaneous. They all stopped and raised their rifles to their shoulders. 3 focused on John, but others started scanning the area with goggles that were attached to their helmets. Something to see in the dark, John figured. John stayed on his knees and didn't move. There are others with me, John said. We have weapons, but we're no threat. John couldn't see any insignia, so he knew either way this was the end of the line. The soldiers were either American reinforcements, and their bid for freedom was over, or they were Texas soldiers who might help them if he played his cards right. Identify yourself, a commanding voice shouted from among the soldiers. John Everman from Illinois, he said, squinting into a flashlight someone had turned on his face. What in God's name are y'all doing down here, John from Illinois? The commanding voice asked. This was the moment that would decide it all, and John knew it. If the soldiers were Americans, he could lie and hope they just sent the refugees home. Neither prospect something... Ooh, no. So if the soldiers were American, he could lie and hope they just sent the refugees home. period. If they were Texans, he could tell the truth and hope they believed him and helped his people. He'd quickly made up his mind to tell the truth when the decision was made for him. "Sir, that's him," a voice behind the lights said. The John Everman from the radio." "Explain, Sergeant." The commanding voice was quieter, as if he turned to talk to another. John couldn't hear the conversation between the two, so he waited patiently in the grass. Two soldiers, at their commander's request, did start letting people sit up, but asked them to lay their weapons in front of them. They were moving among the refugees, checking for lay their firearms in front of them. They were moving among the refugees, checking for weapons and helping people up. They even checked wounds to make sure none were life-threatening. One of them stopped a few feet behind John when he realized he didn't know where Casey was. "You can sit up, sir. Do you have any weapons on you?" the soldier said to whoever was lying in the grass behind John. "I'm not armed," John heard Casey say, followed by a rustling as the agent sat up. Oops. "Whoa there," the soldier said, and John heard a rattling sound as something shifted against the soldier's harness. John imagined he was shouldering his rifle. "We have a Fed over here," the soldier called out. The entire scene turned nightmarish as soldiers stepped forward with their weapons raised again. People were shouting things like spy and traitor, and John's people were cowering in the grass under the intimidating effect. He was thankful no one went for their weapon. He was thankful, well, I need to change that. He was thankful none of his people went for their weapons. "Wait," John shouted. "He's with us. He helped us." Everyone was shouting at once, so John wasn't sure if anyone heard him. He didn't want to move to provoke the soldiers, but he couldn't sit by and let something happen to Casey either. A sharp whistle cut above the shouting before John made up his mind on what to do. "Hold on now. Stand down," the commander shouted above the noise. Discipline and training took over, and the orders were followed. Soldiers lowered their weapons to a ready but less threatening position, and the source of the voice stepped into the light, followed by another. John could now see clearly and recognize the Texan flag on the officer's shoulder, as well as the man beside him. Their uniforms were identical to those American soldiers wore, but bore different insignia. The two men approached John. "So, you are the man everyone's been talking about," the shorter of the two said. John recognized his voice as the one calling the shots. The officer offered his hand and helped John to his feet while he shook it. "I don't know about that, sir. Just John, and these are my friends and family," John said, again embarrassed that someone outside their group, especially someone in another country, knew who he was. "And this officer?" The officer nodded behind John. "He's your friend?" "Not exactly, sir," John said. "He's been trying to stop us, but we had to bring him along after we caught him. Too risky to let him go until we reached Texas." "I heard about your trip," the officer nodded. "What should we do about your friend now, though?" "I offered him a choice to come with us, and I think he should still have that chance, sir," John said. "Everyone has a right to choose. Let him come with us or go home, whichever he chooses." The two men looked at each other, each measuring the other. John saw a slight smile turn up on the corner of the officer's mouth, but as soon as it was there, it was gone again. The serious soldier was back in place and back in command. "This is your unit, John." The soldier waved his hand at the civilians. "Your call." "Sir?" The man beside the officer looked concerned. We are going to finish this tonight. I'm excited. And I lost my place. There we go. "There's no danger to us, Sergeant, but by the time the Fed gets anywhere, we'll be long gone," the officer said. John nodded and turned to Casey. The officer... Casey hadn't moved, still kneeling in the grass with his hands laced behind his head. "Lieutenant, I asked you once if you wanted to come with us. That opportunity is still open," John said. He wasn't of a mind to try convincing Casey, and he knew it wouldn't help if the answer was no. It wouldn't help if the man had made up his mind already. I can't, John. That's not my world. I can't change to fit it, and it won't change to fit me, Casey said. John nodded, expecting that answer. He started to turn back to the officer, but Casey stopped him. Wait, John. I have something you might want to take with you. Casey reached for his bag, and the soldier closest raised his rifle. Well, there. What are you reaching for? Casey stopped midway to his bag. Stand down, Corporal. The officer. The military. We're getting officers mixed up. The Texan officer commanded. The soldier lowered his weapon a bit, and Casey slowly opened his bag and showed the soldier what was inside. The corporal looked slightly embarrassed when Casey retrieved a stuffed bear from the bag. I found this in the van at the border. Someone might be missing him. The federal officer handed the toy to John. John took the bear slowly. He was surprised Casey had kept it and wanted it returned. He looked down at the glass eyes of the toy, staring at him. It seemed like the horror of the flight past Fort Joplin melted away as his children came to mind. He was thankful that they were safe and that he might see them soon. Good luck, John. John looked up through moistened eyes and took Casey's hand in a firm grip, shaking it in goodbye. Not another word passed between the two, and Casey just nodded to the corporal before turning and walking north. So I think we need to hold on. The federal agent stood and handed the toy to John. Yeah, there we go. Not another word passed between the two, and Casey just nodded to the corporal before turning and walking north toward Fort Joplin. Everyone watched him go, but no one moved until he was into the dark trees behind them. Sergeant, we're going to need a lift out of here, the officer said. The man beside him stepped aside and started speaking into the radio on his shoulder. The officer turned back to John. I admire y'all's determination to get to Texas, John. Doing this all on your own and all. Admire y'all's determination to get to Texas, John. Doing this all on your own and all that is a big deal. Yeah, let's see if that sounds more. I admire y'all's determination to get to Texas, John. And yes, word, y'all's is... Actually, it might be wanting me to do this. Actually, yeah, it should be that, which I know it's not going to like. So we're just going to do that. This is our author's creative license right there. I hope you don't mind if we give you a lift the rest of the way, the officer said with a smile. John looked around, his own relief plain on his face. There were smiles and nods from everyone, sighs of relief and even subdued cheers. John let out a breath, one he felt like he'd been holding since walking out of his house in Illinois, and turned back to the officer. We'd appreciate that, sir, John said, holding out his hand. And in lieu of an epilogue, we have a debriefing. Texas isn't a perfect utopia. Be careful of anyone peddling that word. You can be sure their version is not the same as yours. And okay, so I said that wrong. Be careful of anyone peddling that word. You can be sure their version is not the same as yours, and they only care about one of them. We have our share of issues, disagreements, and stress, but at least it's for the right reasons. People understand that it's good and healthy, and above all, we're free. Put that here. I like this phrase. I actually use this phrase. This is mine, my quote. I inserted that in there. But definitely be sure of somebody that's selling you a perfect world, or somebody that's selling you utopia. Whenever anybody tells you that they're going to make your life better, that they're going to give you something that's going to make your life better, be careful, because their version of a good life may not be the same as your version. Their version of a utopia may not be the same as yours. And so you can't always trust that you're getting what you feel. So look more for the people that want to give you the opportunity to pursue your utopia, not the people that are trying to give it to you. Because I mean, it's only logical. They can't know what you need and what you want. They may think that, but they don't. So talking about Texas, he says people understand that it's good and healthy, meaning the stress and disagreements and issues. We all know what it looks like when people try to solve disagreements by removing freedom or bullying others into like-mindedness. Will we remember in 200 years? I don't know. It might all happen again, but we've got another chance to do it right. Someone once said that America was the last bastion of freedom, but whoever said that was wrong. The human heart is the last fortress of liberty and the last hope for freedom. As long as the human heart beats, it will beat to be free. Some people will ignore it, and some are afraid to listen. But as long as enough people are around, there will be some who will do anything to have it. Excerpt from the Journal of John Everman. Lieutenant Casey sat in a straight-backed metal chair across the plain metal desk from his supervisor. He waited patiently, staring at nothing, while his boss read Casey's report on the last few days. He didn't look around or fidget. There wasn't anything to look at anyway. The same gray walls were bare except for a picture of the president. The desk was free of anything except the necessary tools for the officer's job. There was nothing else in the small office because nothing else was needed. So this fugitive, Bernard, the other officer said after setting the pages down. You let him go because you didn't think he could be re-educated. That's correct, sir. It would have been a waste of resources. Are you trying to take an analyst's job away, Lieutenant? The other officer asked. No, sir, Your job isn't to think, Lieutenant, Casey's supervisor cut him off. The analysts think, and it's our job to uphold the letter of the law. Yes, sir. Why did you fail to capture the fugitives before your men's contract time was up? I had some of them, sir, but they were resourceful people, Casey said. Resourceful? They were just common workers. How resourceful could they be? And I think the perspective is different in the field, sir, and they had help, Casey said, slowly letting his anger slip as he realized the failure of his mission was going to fall squarely on his shoulders. The barb hit its target, and Casey's supervisor sat back stiffly, and his eyes narrowed. Lieutenant Casey, the officer said in clipped tones, since you have shown obvious inadequacies in the field of command, you will be reassigned as a junior field agent. Casey nodded. Further, your record will permanently show that you failed to follow orders, complete your mission, and were in violation of your contract time. A poor example for your subordinates. Let's make that a new sentence. Casey didn't react. With that stain on his record, he would never be a field agent again. He would never be more. Oh, I wrote that right. With that stain on his record, he would never be more than a field agent again. The ignorance of the charges was almost laughable as he wondered if he would have felt the same. The ignorance of the charges was almost laughable. He wondered if he would have felt the same had he not met John and his people. Before, duty had been everything, but now to be charged with failing in his mission and also reprimanded for working past his contract to try was beyond reason. He resisted the urge to laugh out loud. Officer Casey, you're dismissed, his supervisor said in exasperation. Casey looked up at him. The girl, sir? What girl? Casey's supervisor snapped. The politician's daughter, the missing persons report that pulled most of my men away. Was she found? Casey asked. Oh, his supervisor dismissed that with a wave of his hand. She was found the morning after the Fort Joplin incident. She was unharmed and said her abductors didn't abuse her or demand anything. Strange. Did they capture him? No sign of him. She wandered into a station house in Hope, Maryland, the morning after the battle. Thank you, sir. Casey stood up and left the office. So that's sort of the enlightenment into what happened here with the girl, and why Casey lost his help that he had to try to capture these people. It was, well, it's supposed to leave you with the ambiguous idea that it may have been set up to undermine Casey's mission in any way. So then we scene change here, and the office of the Chief of Immigrant Affairs was not what John expected, or rather, not what he was used to. The immigration official sat behind a large wooden desk that was a mosaic of organized chaos. Light tan walls were hung with pictures of family members, friends, and co-workers, and the flag of the Republic of Texas stood on its stand in the corner. I actually make that a separate. The flag of the Republic of Texas stood on its stand in the corner. There were books on a shelf across the room from John, who sat in one of the two comfortable chairs opposite the official. Rather than a reflection of society as John was used to, the room was a reflection of the man that worked in it. We have a bus ready to take you folks wherever you want to start over. The official was folding some papers and sliding them into a small passport book. Everyone had made it and been reunited at the military base near the border. Sarah's group had been picked up shortly after breaching the fence, and after telling their story, she and the children had been moved to the facility to wait for the rest. Even Benny had made it, crossing the border further down the line 2 nights after his release. The toy bear had been returned to his excited friend. "Thank you, sir. We appreciate it," John said. He was still overwhelmed with being in Texas, even after a week in the processing station near the Oklahoma-Missouri border. "Call me Eric, John," the official said. "Now there's enough money in there to get you started." John hadn't expected a handout and started to protest. "Well, John, it's a loan. It's not free money, so don't worry." Apparently Eric had been following John's journey enough to get a sense of the man. "Your passport is done and your temporary citizenship papers are in here," Eric continued. "When you decide on a place to settle, stop in at the local immigration office. They'll help you make the transition." John took the packet and looked through it while Eric watched. The papers reminded him of all the regulation in his old life, the forms, identification, and numbers that told him where he fit in to best help society. He kept telling himself they were needed to make sure he could find his own place wherever he wanted. "Can I ask, why did y'all leave Illinois? Why did you risk everything to come here?" Eric asked. It appeared to John as if the other had been waiting to ask that the entire time. John took a moment to think, knowing Eric wasn't asking just to hear a generic answer about freedom or patriotism. "The kids, mostly," John began. "I was tired of waiting in the same lines for the same work and the same food, sending my kids to the same school so they could do the same work for the same rations. Also, everyone can be the same. I couldn't stand to look at everyone standing in the same line anymore. But most of all, I didn't want my kids to grow up thinking that was normal. Everyone back there is either dead without knowing it or struggling for breath. I don't want my kids to have room to breathe." The answer seemed to satisfy Eric's curiosity, and he smiled, sitting back. "What do you plan to do now, John?" Eric asked. "Whatever I want." And so that concludes the last Exodus, which I believe is going to be called Embers of Liberty when it gets released. I'm not sure exactly when that's going to happen. I expect it to be before the end of the year. I have started the process, sort of, so watch the Twitter feed for that. Watch announcements and things like that. I will again post the link to this online book so you can read it if you want. You can read the whole text yourself at your own pace. But I do plan to have this released in ebook form and paperback within hopefully a month. But you know, I'm gonna shoot more realistically and just say before the end of the year. I am also working on getting a short story collection ready to go and published as well, which I hope to take to next year's Gen Con. So stay tuned for information on that. I believe I'm going to do some sort of funding to get you guys the book, but also try to help earn enough money in a big lump before we go to Gen Con so they can help pay for the booth fees and the insurance and the advanced copies I'm going to need to order to sell at Gen Con. So stay tuned for that. And what else? We will start another Tales from the Dragons library soon for the book I'm currently writing, which is in its initial draft stage. So it will be a little different than this particular show, in which I've been reading a book that's done and editing as I go. At some point we will catch up to where I have written in the first book of Maya's trilogy, which is sort of its working title. We will catch up to where I'm at there, and I will have to probably write for you live as well as read and edit. So we'll see how that goes. But thank you guys so much for joining me. If you've watched the whole series, I really appreciate it. If you do have any comments or questions, please be sure to drop them in the chat or comments in the videos. Drop by Twitter, ask questions there. If you have any questions about writing or editing or publishing, I'll do my best. I've got 2 works currently on Amazon, so look for Wastelander and Wastelander Not As They Appear. They're short stories that are on Amazon. The 3rd one of those will come out soon, both by itself and as part of my short story collection, which I plan to put out soon. And I think that's about it. Saturday's up in the air about our stream there, because I will be smoking some wonderful meats all day. But I am going to try to get you guys the second part of the Guild Wars 2 stream to wrap up the newest living story, so that we can also start Star Control the week after. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. You guys have a wonderful rest of your week, and hopefully I will see you Saturday. You guys have fun. I'll see you next time. Much love.